Hello and welcome to the CivilNet studio. Today our guest is Steve Swerdlow, a human rights lawyer and associate professor of human rights at the University of Southern California. He has a particular expertise in Central Asia, and as a result, he's been watching us over here in Armenia for years. He's spent time working in the Caucasus region and has a lot to say about what's happening here as well. So, Professor Swerdlow, thank you so much for being here.
It's an honor to be at CivilNet, Paul. Thank you.
Oh, we're glad to have you. So we're going to speak in this interview about human rights, but not generally. We're going to focus in on one aspect that I think doesn't get as much attention as the many other issues that unfortunately we have going on here. So between the aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 and the ethnic cleansing of 2023, we also had in September of 2022 aggression against Armenia itself. And a lot of what we hear about Nagorno-Karabakh is, oh, well, that's not technically Armenia internationally, and you know, we can't do anything. But here we have a real life example of war crimes being committed within Armenian territory. So if that's not, you know, a human rights violation, I don't know what is. So what does the particular case mean in this human rights context?
Well, Paul, you're absolutely right that this deserves attention. We're talking about the early hours of September 12th or September 13th, 2022, when Azerbaijani forces attacked Armenia proper, the sovereign boundaries of Armenia. This attack encompassed between 11 or more villages and settlements. It took the lives of between 200 and 300 Armenian soldiers. It also tragically included the capture of several Armenian female soldiers. We know some of their names, like Gayane Abgaryan, who was tragically and brutally tortured, mutilated, and images of that incident were then disseminated on Telegram channels by the Azerbaijani state. These were some of the most grotesque and brutal moments in this history of conflict, in this history of attacks by Azerbaijan. And precisely because Armenia has recently ratified the International Criminal Court statute, making it one of the newest members, only Ukraine has been more recently become a member, because Armenia is at the center of international legal attention, we could say, or at the forefront of international law accountability efforts, I think that is why I and other scholars are focusing more on this act of aggression, the idea of the crime of aggression that Azerbaijan has committed against Armenia. Aggression, if we remember back to Nuremberg to 1945, it was one of the 4 crimes that Nazi Germany was thought to have committed. That is the crime of illegally invading the territory of another sovereign state. It's the crime from which only then war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanity are possible, only after you've invaded a country. And so therefore, there's been more increased discussion about whether or not Azerbaijan could be held accountable for its actions in 2022, likening it in some ways to what we're discussing about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is the classic textbook case. And so I've come to Armenia to analyze those issues. I had the honor once again to meet with the sister of Gayane Abgaryan and other victims of the 2022 events. And I've come to the conclusion that the attack certainly warrants that definition of aggression. This was looking at the size of Armenia, looking at the number of casualties, Armenia's small military, and more importantly, let's say the fact that this continues, the fact that Azerbaijani troops surround Armenia, especially in Sunik province, shooting daily. I've met with some villagers from there that tell me about how they live every day with fire directed at their homes. And this occupation, let's call it what it is under the statute, occupation, bombardment of Armenian sovereign territory, is one of the most egregious crimes in international law. And it deserves accountability. And if we can deal with some of the difficult jurisdictional issues that probably are beyond the time we have here today, I do think that there is going to come a moment when, whether it's in The Hague, at the International Criminal Court, or if it's using universal jurisdiction in another court in the United States or in a place like Argentina, I think we will see Azerbaijan held to account for the act of aggression concerning again, like you said, not only the attack on Nagorno-Karabakh and the war crimes committed in 2020 and after, and the blockade, of course, in 2022, 2023, but also the attack on Armenia itself. This is existential. It continues, and it includes, like I said, a sort of environmental catastrophe in which access to water and pasture on the part of the villagers is being reduced every day. It's a chokehold on Armenia. And it should ring alarm bells for anyone interested in Armenia's sovereignty, its freedom, its human rights.
And when it comes to holding accountable, I mean, what we've seen recently is Aliyev be welcomed again by the EU back into their fold. We have an Armenian government which seems to be afraid to speak out about these things, or let alone bring a case at the ICC, International Criminal Court.
Well, you know, the fight for international accountability and human rights, it's a long arc. I can tell you that friends of mine in the human rights movement that worked on the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo never dreamed that Milosevic would be sitting in the dock, but he ended up there. No one thought that Charles Taylor of Liberia would be serving a life sentence right now outside of London for his crimes in Sierra Leone and Liberia, but it happened. Same thing with Omar al-Bashir from Sudan. We've seen remarkable advances. Right now, though, we're living through a period where, you know, we're taking 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 steps back, and we see how the position of the United States, Hungary, Russia is stymieing international accountability efforts. But I think the momentum is there. And one thing that's exciting, of course, and I applauded Armenia for its ratification of the ICC a few years ago, which opens up all sorts of possibilities. Also, it's really ambitious, you could say dynamic effort to bring cases against Azerbaijan for racial discrimination, for Armenophobia at the International Court of Justice. That's the related court, also in The Hague, the UN court. Now there's a danger, as you said, as part of the ongoing negotiations, that those cases, which are very important, could be withdrawn. And I think that would be a mistake as a lawyer. But I'll tell you that as someone who's independent of a government, I'm a human rights lawyer, we look to other avenues as well. We can use what we call universal jurisdiction, the idea that some crimes, like genocide, are so heinous that they should be tried in any court, in any venue. That means they can be brought in Argentina, they can be brought in Germany, which has become a leading venue. So there are avenues in case the governmental efforts become delayed or too complicated. I'll also say that it's the prosecutor, not the states, it's the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that has the discretion to bring an investigation or to open an investigation into Azerbaijan's crimes. And as you know, because CivilNet was following this, there was a petition filed asking for an investigation into genocide, including the 2022 events, focusing in part on what I mentioned, these brutal crimes that are premised and are only possible because of decades of Armenophobia and hatred that is inculcated into the staff. So and I'll just finally say that I think the other effort is sanctions, Paul. It's in the United States, we passed a law called the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows you to bring sanctions, freeze bank accounts, and deny visas to the worst abusers for the worst crimes. And we have had a tentative record. There has been one Azerbaijani official put on that list, but there need to be more put on that list.
Sounds like a warning shot that right now we have a lot going on with the US and Azerbaijan and Armenia kind of triangulating this. And so it will be interesting to see if Azerbaijan decides not to play ball in the way that the US does. Does that mean there are more sanctions to follow? We don't know. But I want to pick up on one thing that you said about this legacy of hatred being inculcated. What happens when a society or a country is in a permanent war state of mind? What happens to human rights considerations domestically? Like, is that an issue for Armenia? Is it vulnerable to that? But also just hatred as well. I mean, what is a peace? We sign a peace with Azerbaijan, but they are taught day after day that Armenians are the enemies. They are people that are less than human. How do you then go from signing a peace treaty with these inhuman people and then the next step, which should be living together? I don't know how these things work. And yet we can't stop Azerbaijan from teaching what it teaches.
Absolutely, and I earlier had opportunities to visit Azerbaijan as a human rights monitor for a small NGO, and then I worked at Human Rights Watch for a number of years and did missions there. And unfortunately, I had a front row seat to the rising levels of Armenophobia, the state-sanctioned policies in textbooks, and just that you would encounter, unfortunately, across society, this demonization of Armenians as responsible for every ill in society, for every problem. And of course, we know it's a governing strategy for Ilham Aliyev to prolong his rule, to consolidate his power. And so that, unfortunately, it's a ghastly phenomenon, and it needs to be countered. And that's why part of my research was to support and to buttress Armenia's case against Azerbaijan, filed at the International Court of Justice precisely about racial discrimination. That was brought under the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, looking at Armenophobia. And as we recall, the court issued advisory measures to Azerbaijan during the blockade, not only telling it to lift the blockade, but also telling it to stop engaging in Armenophobic rhetoric and policies, which it has not done. And I've had an opportunity while being here in Armenia to meet with Armenian NGO colleagues who tell me that even at the OSCE diplomatic meetings that are dedicated to fostering tolerance, they are hearing continually, not just bellicose, but absolutely racist statements from the Azerbaijani delegations talking about eventually looking forward to drinking tea in the Blue Mosque in Yerevan if Armenia doesn't concede to what they like. And so absolutely, you're right. This is not going in the right direction. And what we need is the international legal framework to be followed. We have precisely the instructions that Baku needs from the International Court of Justice to dispense with its policies, to open up the country to more scrutiny. Obviously, they've recently shut the door to the International Committee for the Red Cross to visit prisoners. They've reduced the presence of the UN. So all the signs are pointing in the wrong direction. And I think that's the moment when you need sanctions, you need accountability. Now, as to your question regarding Armenia, what happens when a country is in a permanent war state? Well, it's a precarious time. It's a time when, look, one democracy, the democracy I visited, which was the Republic of Artsakh, is now no more. And that was one of the reasons that I felt so strongly that we need to tell this story loud and clear, that what was created in Nagorno-Karabakh, including an office for human rights defense, a human rights ombudsman, one of them staffed by the great Artak Beglarian, that was a very important achievement that Armenia and Artsakh created, which was a democracy, a fledgling one, but a democracy. And given that, given the fragility of democracy, given what we're all living through at this particular moment in the United States and beyond, it's important that Armenia recommit to human rights principles. It's important that it uphold the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that it signed, guaranteeing freedom of expression, assembly, association. So it's a moment when I think Armenia should be recommitting to democratic ideals, human rights, in every aspect, as difficult as that is, including electoral rights. And that's the example that Armenia sets for this region. And in fact, one other maybe detailed or additional factor here that I would be remiss in not mentioning is watching what's happening to the north of us. Georgia, which was leading the region in democratic development, has now taken many steps back. And in fact, just a week ago, finalized its foreign agents legislation, which again strangles the life out of civil society, really adopting a Russia-style law that stands to extinguish many of the gains made. And I'm not even speaking about entering the EU. I'm just talking about safeguarding democracy, safeguarding civil society's role. That's what makes Armenia strong. That's what made Karabakh strong. And I think that needs to remain at the center of domestic policy and foreign policy.
Yeah, just look to history. What happened going on 80 years ago, 90 years ago, when in Europe they humiliated a certain country, and it was a democracy for a time and became something completely different. Thank you so much for all the insights that you brought to us. It's really great to talk it over and bring attention to some of these things that don't get talked about as much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paul. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for joining CivilNet.